He found an old tree stump in the woods. Underneath it was something no one was ever meant to see. And from that moment, nothing went the way it should. Want to know what was hidden inside? Subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. He had not set foot on that land in more than a decade, yet nothing about the place felt unfamiliar. The narrow dirt road that led to the property was almost swallowed by weeds now, but the curve of it, the way it sloped slightly before straightening out near the clearing, lived in his memory with the clarity of something walked 1,000 times. Even before he reached the end of the path, before the trees opened into the quiet patch where the house once stood, he already knew what would not be there. No porch, no warped wooden steps, no windows clouded with dust. The fire had taken all of that 15 years ago, and nature had done the rest. He stopped where the fence used to be. A single rusted nail remained on a weathered post, the last witness of a gate that had once swung open to welcome family, neighbors, laughter. The silence now was absolute, broken only by the distant crack of a branch somewhere deep in the trees. The air carried that mild scent of late autumn earth-cold soil, mixed with the sweetness of rotting leaves, and for a moment he felt as if time itself had paused to observe him. He walked forward slowly, not out of hesitation, but because memory insisted on matching every step. A faint rectangle of flattened ground marked where the house had been, the soil slightly different in color, like an imprint of something that refused to vanish completely. To the left should have been the old well, and yes, there was the circle of stones, overgrown with moss, the metal bucket long gone, but the rope hook still visible, rust welded into permanence. He circled it once, then turned his attention toward the far side of the clearing, where the garden and the small wooden gazebo had once stood. That was when he noticed the stump. It stood where the gazebo used to be, and that alone was enough to make him pause. The gazebo had been built on a raised wooden platform. There had never been a tree there. Yet now a thick stump, wide and heavy, anchored itself in the center of the space like it had belonged there for a lifetime. At first glance it looked natural, softened by moss and time, but something about it was wrong. It was too cleanly cut across the top, too level, too deliberate. Its circumference was larger than any of the remaining trees nearby, as if the forest had grown around a stranger. He stepped closer, his boots pressing into the soft earth. The stump bore shallow cracks along the grain, the type that came from age rather than weather. It must have stood there at least 10, maybe 20 years, long enough for insects to carve tiny channels into its base. Yet the top, though cracked, did not have the smooth sheen of decades in the open. Instead, it looked as if it had been fitted back into place, like a lid. He crouched and brushed away the dried leaves. There was a subtle lip across one side, a faint sliver of shadow where wood did not fully meet wood. He pressed the edge of his hand against it, testing. It shifted, just barely a fraction of a centimeter, enough to feel rather than see. He tried again, harder this time, and the top of the stump lifted a little, like an old cellar door reluctant to open. He exhaled slowly, a stump that could be opened, a stump where a building used to stand. Someone had put it here, or used it for something. He went back to the car and retrieved a pair of work gloves from the passenger seat. In the trunk, beneath a tarp, lay a small pry bar he carried for fence repair. He returned to the stump, wedged the bar into the seam, and leaned his weight into it. The top of the stump rose with a muted creak, severed roots snapping like tendons. It was heavy, but not impossibly so, more like a lid than the remains of a once-living tree. He set it aside and stared into the hollow beneath. It was not filled with soil or forest rot as he expected. Instead, a shallow depression lined with thick, dark fabric. Some kind of weather-resistant tarp rested neatly inside. Nestled at the bottom was a metal container, army green beneath patches of rust, rectangular, with a hinged clasp that had once been silver. Its surface was speckled with age, but the corners were sharp, intact. Someone had placed it there carefully, protected it from moisture, hidden it beneath a stump that was never meant to be found. He reached in and lifted it. The box was heavier than it looked, the weight of iron and time. He set it on the ground beside him and opened the latch. The hinges protested at first, then gave way with a dry metallic sigh. Inside were 4 audio cassette tapes, individually wrapped in plastic to protect them from dampness. Each had a label written in the same narrow, deliberate handwriting. Beside them lay a single folded page, yellowed but intact. The ink had not bled. The creases were crisp. He unfolded it. "If you have found this, it means I am already gone. Please listen to the recordings in full. What you choose to do afterward is yours alone. I could not carry it any longer." There was no name, no date, no plea for forgiveness, only that quiet final sentence, and the silence that followed it seemed to expand into the clearing like a held breath. He sat still for a long moment, the page resting against his knee, the 4 tapes staring up at him like small black verdicts. He did not feel excitement or fear, only the kind of dense curiosity that presses against the back of the mind and refuses to leave. Someone had gone to great trouble to hide this. Someone had expected that one day it would be found. He replaced the Stump lid, not fully, but enough to disguise the hollow, and carried the box back to the car. The metal felt cold through the gloves, colder than the air around him, almost as if it held its own temperature. Even when he set it on the passenger seat, a strange heaviness lingered, the impression that the weight inside was not metal, but something human. He drove away slowly, glancing at the stump in the rearview mirror, until the trees swallowed the clearing again. The land was silent, but no longer empty. Whatever had been buried there was not finished yet. The box shifted slightly on the seat beside him as the car climbed the road, and he felt, for the first time, that he had not uncovered something forgotten, but something waiting. It would not wait much longer. When he reached home, he carried the box inside, placed it on the table, and stood over it for a moment before removing the gloves. The recordings sat untouched, but not for long. There would be no peace until he heard what was on them. The note had not asked him for anything except attention, and attention was the one thing he could no longer withhold. He did not know yet what was inside those tapes, but he knew with a certainty he did not understand that whatever lay recorded there would pull him deeper into a story that had begun long before he arrived and was not finished with him yet. He turned on the lamp, the light pooling across the table, and reached for the first cassette. The past was no longer buried. It was only paused. The first cassette sat in his hand longer than he expected, as if the act of pressing play required a kind of permission he had not yet earned. The box remained open on the table beside him, untouched except for the space where the tape had been. The folded note lay nearby, its few printed words still carrying more gravity than any elaborate confession ever could. He had read it again after bringing the box inside, not because he doubted what it said, but because the simplicity of the message made it impossible to ignore. It was the sort of sentence a person writes only when they believe there will be no second chance to explain themselves. He set the cassette into the player he had bought that afternoon, a scuffed, older model that still worked after a bit of cleaning and press play. The tape rolled forward with a faint hiss, the familiar mechanical whir of wheels turning magnetic ribbon. Then after a few seconds of soft static, a voice emerged. It was a man's voice, steady, low, almost clinical. No greeting, no preface, just a direct statement spoken into the empty air. "My name is Sergei Antonovich Lebedev, born March the 2nd, 1950. If someone is listening to this, it means I did not find the courage to speak while I was alive. I am recording this because something must remain when I'm gone, something besides silence." The voice was not shaking, not regretful, not frantic. It was the voice of someone who had rehearsed the same words for years, shaping them until they fit into a narrow space between guilt and necessity. He spoke slowly, as if pacing the act of confession against the rhythm of his own breath. He described himself, his trade as an electrical technician, his years working in construction brigades, the move to the region in the late 70s, the circle of friends he had made through a small summer community around the lake. There were no jokes, no personal color, nothing that tried to soften the information. He listed facts the way someone might read the labels on a map, precise, functional, absolute. Then the shift came, a subtle change in the tempo of the voice, not emotional, but unavoidable. He spoke the name of a man, his friend, the one who had disappeared. He spoke it without hesitation, as if the name had never stopped circling inside him. He explained how they had grown close, worked together, spent days off fixing up the old dacha that once stood on the property, now covered only by grass and ash. He did not describe loyalty or friendship in sentimental terms. He simply spoke as if the bond had been obvious then and needed no dramatization now. The first sign that something had gone wrong appeared without warning. A single sentence dropped into the story like a stone through still water. "I did not mean to kill him." The room around him seemed to shrink. The tape did not slow, did not tremble, did not attempt to justify itself. The details followed in the same measured tone. A disagreement one evening, fueled by anger and by the kind of careless pride men never admit they are ruled by. A short walk away from the house to speak privately, voices raised but not enough to draw attention. A shove, a blow, a fall, a rock, or something like it, used instinctively rather than intentionally. A moment of stillness afterward that did not feel real. "I thought he would get up," the voice said. "When he didn't, I thought it was because he had been knocked unconscious. When I realized he wasn't breathing, I did not think about calling for help. I thought only of myself." There was no shift in tone, no crack in the voice, no attempt to soften the truth. The man on the tape spoke not like someone asking for forgiveness, but like someone handing over a file he did not want to carry anymore. He explained how he dragged the body deeper into the trees, how he buried it quickly, without tools, knowing the soil was soft enough in the valley near the old spruce roots. He spoke of the panic afterward, the numb silence, the way he cleaned himself mechanically before going back inside. He described how he fabricated concern when others asked where his friend had gone, how he helped organize the search, how he spoke to police and said the words that would eventually close the missing person report without resolution. "Everyone believed me," he said. "It was easier for them to believe than to doubt, and I let them." The tape paused then, not because the man hesitated, but because he had stopped recording that day. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the quiet of a man who had lived 40 years past a single moment he never escaped. The player clicked softly and stopped. He left the cassette inside and did not press rewind. The silence in the room felt dense, the kind that demanded careful breathing. He reached for the next tape, hesitate just long enough to feel the weight of the choice, then inserted it. The second recording began with no preamble. The man spoke openly about the years that followed, the career, the family, the steady, outwardly respectable life built upon something that never stopped decaying beneath it. He spoke of guilt not as emotion, but as routine, something that woke with him every morning and lay beside him every night. He spoke of visiting the property after the fire, of seeing the land burned and believing that perhaps nature had begun the erasure he could not. But then he spoke of the stump he himself had placed there, cutting and hollowing it, preparing a space for the metal box. He said he had recorded all 4 tapes over a span of weeks during an illness he knew he would not survive. The effort of burying the box, of covering it, of ensuring it would not rot, all of it had been done not to hide the truth, but to keep it intact until someone else was forced to confront it. "I could not confess while the people I love lived beside me, but I also could not take this secret into the ground. I leave the decision to you, whoever you are. I am not asking to be forgiven. I am asking not to be buried twice." When the second tape ended, the air in the room felt heavier than before. He sat without moving, staring at the player, the soft, almost comforting hum of the stop mechanism, the only sound in the house. There were still 2 more tapes, 2 more layers to the same truth. But the story was already complete enough to be undeniable. It was not a riddle, not a puzzle, not a confession wrapped in self-pity. It was a door, opened and left with no instructions about whether to walk through. He turned off the lamp, but the box on the table remained in his vision long after the room darkened. The stump, the burned land, the name of the dead man, the calm voice of the one who killed him. All of it now existed inside him, not as something discovered, but something inherited. And he understood, with a heaviness that could not be separated from him anymore, that what he had found was not an object, but a responsibility. He did not sleep. When morning finally came, the box was still there, unchanged, waiting. The story had only begun. Morning arrived without rest. The house was bright, the world outside unchanged. But nothing in his thoughts resembled the ordinary rhythm of a new day. The cassette player sat motionless where he had left it, the box beside it half open, as if waiting for him to return to a story that had no intention of loosening its hold. He had not listened to the final 2 tapes yet, but he already knew enough to understand that the voice on the recordings had not exaggerated or invented anything for effect. Every word had been spoken as if fact were the only language the man still trusted. But certainty demanded more than belief. It demanded proof. He spent the early hours sitting at the table with a notebook, writing down everything he could remember from the first 2 tapes. Names, dates, the description of the land as it once was, the implied location of the burial, references to friends and coworkers, the year of the disappearance, the police search, the absence of evidence. The account had not been told emotionally. It had been told like a ledger, entry precise, measured, unforgiving. That made it more dangerous, not less. A lie embellished itself. A truth rarely bothered. He turned on his computer and began searching online archives, digitized newspaper records, abandoned forum threads, scanned local newsletters uploaded by hobbyists who couldn't let old stories disappear. He searched the name of the missing man first, expecting to find nothing more than a brief mention. Instead, he found fragments. A missing person notice dated 35 years earlier, published by a regional newspaper. A short article describing a group of friends vacationing near the lake when one of them vanished overnight. A follow-up 2 months later. Investigation closed due to lack of leads. The tone was casual, almost dismissive, as if the disappearance had been inconvenient rather than tragic. But the name, the photograph, and the location all matched the information from the tape. He continued searching old scanned documents until he found a police report summary posted in a public archive. It listed the case number, the missing man's full name, and the final classification, presumed voluntary departure. The euphemism echoed the exact phrase used on the recording. The voice had not misremembered. It had not inflated details or dramatized them. It had reported them exactly as they appeared on official paper. He sat back, staring at the screen, feeling a strange blend of validation and dread. If the man on the tape had lied, it would have been easier. A lie could be dismissed, ignored, burned with the box and forgotten. But a truth that aligned with records, that fit neatly into the space where the world had chosen not to look, that was something far heavier. He opened a map next, pulling up an aerial view of the land. The forested area was larger now than it had been decades ago, the clearing smaller, the soil darker after years of weather and regrowth. He overlaid an older photograph from a government survey, tracing the outline of where the house once stood, the old fence, the visible path leading into the woods. Then he marked the stump, recalling the precise spot where it stood, right where the gazebo used to be, a place shaded in summer, where visitors had once sat for tea and talked about nothing of consequence. The land had not forgotten the conversation that now pulsed beneath it. He printed the map, drew a rough radius from the stump to the tree line, marking the direction described on the tape. The burial site, if it existed, lay not far from the property line, but concealed by a shallow dip in the terrain, a natural hollow where water collected after rain. If he could locate that dip, he could at least confirm the plausibility of the claim. He could stand where the body might still lie. He did not want to dig. He did not want to find bones. He only wanted to know whether the man had spoken with the precision of memory or the invention of guilt. By the time the sun had reached its highest point, he was already at the edge of the woods again, walking the same path he had walked the day before, only now with a sharper focus. Every tree, every uneven step, every faint depression in the soil felt connected to a thread that stretched backward into a night long before he ever imagined he would care about the past lives of a place. He paused near the stump, not out of sentiment but orientation. The recorded voice had mentioned the direction. Northwest, past the old spruce roots, where the land dips and holds moisture even in dry seasons. He turned, scanned the ground, and began walking, measuring distance in steps and landmarks rather than numbers. The land did dip, just as described. A shallow bowl of earth stretched ahead, not visibly remarkable, but noticeable to someone who understood how natural ground should lie. He crouched, brushed aside the top layer of fallen leaves, and pressed his hand against the soil. Beneath the surface, the ground was softer, looser, not compact the way untouched forest floor often was. It was the kind of subtle irregularity that meant the earth had once been disturbed and then left to settle undisturbed for decades. He took out a lightweight probe he had brought, a gardener's soil rod, and pressed it into the ground. It sank farther than expected before meeting resistance. Not rock, not clay. Something else. Something foreign to a forest floor. He did not press deeper. He marked the ground discreetly with a small piece of twine tied to a low branch. Not to claim it, not to expose it, but to remember. He stood there for a long while, not because he was afraid, but because standing was all he could do. He was aware that he was alone in the woods, that the world around him had continued as if no one had ever died here. There were no ghosts, no whispers, no sense of punishment, only the quiet, indifferent presence of nature, which had accepted what had been hidden in it the way earth accepts anything buried long enough. He walked back to the clearing slowly, the soil impressions still in his gloves, the map in his pocket feeling heavier than paper should. The stump greeted him again like an object that had never moved, never changed, but now he could no longer look at it as a piece of wood. It was a door without hinges, a marker of silence built deliberately to outlast the man who placed it there. He returned home before dusk, placed the box back on the table, and opened the notebook again. He now had enough to confirm that the man on the tape had not confessed to imagination. He had confessed to something real, something buried, something still present and unclaimed. He rewound the second cassette knot to listen again, but to be sure it was preserved. Then he picked up the third tape, knowing that whatever came next would not undo what was already true. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the slight imperfections in the plastic, the tiny scratches that proved it had lived a long time before reaching him. There was no longer any distance between him and the story. He was no longer a spectator. He was the only living witness to a truth that had been waiting for decades, a truth that could only continue forward through him. The choice was still ahead, not yet demanded, but it had already formed a shape. When he pressed play again, he did not expect answers. He expected responsibility, and that was exactly what the voice delivered. The third tape ended long after night had settled over the house, and although his eyes burned from exhaustion, he did not turn off the lamp or move from the chair. The voice on the recording had not changed in tone, but something about it felt heavier now, as if the man had begun speaking not only to unburden himself, but to explain why he had remained silent for so long. There were mentions of family, of a wife who did not know what she lived beside, of a son who deserved a name free of shadows, of a life built carefully so that no one around him ever suspected what lay beneath it. The man had not spoken of love, but of obligation, of the instinct to protect others from the worst version of oneself, not out of nobility, but because exposure would not only destroy the guilty, but also those who never chose involvement. It was the first time the man's words hinted at something close to emotion, though it was delivered with the same calm restraint as everything else. He listened almost to the end before pausing the tape and leaning back, letting silence flood the room. He was beginning to understand the structure of the man's confession. It was not random, it was deliberate. Each recording had been built to add a layer to show the crime, the burial, the burden, and finally the reason for concealment. The man had not been asking for forgiveness. He had been preparing someone like him, someone who might one day find the box and need context before making a choice. And that was the part that unsettled him most, the certainty that he was no longer simply discovering a secret, but being prepared to inherit its consequences. He turned off the player and closed the box. Not out of rejection, but because he knew he could not hear another word yet. He needed distance, a boundary, even a temporary one. He stood and walked to the window. Outside, the night was still, the sky cloudless, the stars sharp and cold. Nothing about the world reflected the chaos of what now sat in the center of his life. The past was not supposed to be able to touch the present this directly, this personally, yet here it was, inside his home, on his table, anchored in both his thoughts and the land he had walked earlier that day. He slept only after the sky began to lighten, and even then it was not real sleep, just a drifting state that left him feeling more weighted than rested. By late morning he was in his car again, not heading toward the forest this time, but the neighboring town where records were kept and names still mattered to the people who carried them. He had written down the name of the man on the tape. He knew the dates of his life and death. He knew enough to find those who had never known the truth he had buried. He did not go to them directly. Instead, he walked past the house first, as if circling a place of impact before stepping onto it. The home was well-kept, fresh paint, trimmed hedges, children's chalk drawings still faintly visible on the sidewalk. A car seat strapped in the back of a family vehicle, curtains tied back neatly in the front windows. There was nothing about the house that suggested its former owner carried a secret he had been unable to release in life. That was what struck him most deeply. A truth could sit in the center of a life without changing the outward shape of it, like a stone buried in the foundation of a home that still stands straight. He did not approach the door. He did not ring the bell or invent a reason to speak to the family. He simply watched and left, because he already knew what would happen if the truth surfaced. Faces like those, inside ordinary, unguarded, untouched by anything darker than the daily difficulties of life, would be forced to inherit something they had not created. Whatever punishment the dead man had avoided would be passed on to people who had never swung the stone, never felt the panic of that night, never made the choice to bury a body in a lie. And yet, on the other side of the story, there was another family, the family of the man who had died and never been found. That name he had already written down too, traced through newspapers, traced through birth records, traced until the line ended not in comfort, but in quiet collapse. A sister who had outlived hope and spoken once in an interview about waiting for a phone call that never came. A mother who had died before she could even bury an empty casket. A branch of life cut and left without closure, not just by a single act of violence, but by the silence that followed it. He could not decide which weighed more, the harm that would come from revealing the truth or the harm that had already been shaped by hiding it. He drove to the archives next, requesting a case file that had not been opened in over 30 years. The clerk took time finding it, flipping through indexes until she retrieved a thin folder, its edges softened by age. Inside were only a few pages, a missing persons report, a list of questioned witnesses, a closing note that declared insufficient evidence for foul play. The report was stamped, processed, and forgotten. There was nothing inside the folder that contradicted the recording. In fact, there was not a single detail on the tape that did not align precisely with the file. Even the weather mentioned on the night of the disappearance matched a brief notation: heavy rain, search postponed until morning. The man had remembered everything correctly, not loosely, not approximately, exactly. He folded the file shut and returned it, aware that he was one of the last people who would ever read it before it returned to permanent storage. A piece of history that no longer mattered to anyone except him. As he walked back to the car, he realized the recordings had not merely told a story, they had transferred a question that now followed him everywhere, refusing silence. What is the purpose of truth if telling it destroys the living and hiding it betrays the dead? He sat behind the wheel and let the engine idle, staring at nothing, aware that he could no longer pretend he was an observer. He had gone to the forest, listened to the confession, verified the history, located the burial ground, stood in front of the homes of both families. Every piece was now real. Every consequence now belonged to him, not because he wanted it, but because he was the only one who had access to the whole picture. He drove home with a strange sense that something irreversible had already begun, even though he had not yet made a decision. The tapes sat where he left them. The box waited. The stump in the clearing waited. The body beneath the soil waited. And somewhere, two families continued living in opposite directions, one in false safety, one in unresolved grief. The next step would not be taken by accident. It would have to be chosen. And that was the part he feared most. The decision did not arrive suddenly or dramatically. It did not announce itself with an impulse or a revelation. Instead, it settled into his thoughts slowly, the way a heavy object finds the lowest point in water and rests there, because there is nowhere lower to sink. Days passed without bringing clarity. He woke, moved through routines, cooked without tasting, slept without resting, and each hour only deepened the sense that he was living beside something unresolved rather than moving toward resolution. The tapes were still on the table, the box still open. He did not touch them anymore. There was nothing left to learn from them. The recordings were not unfinished, only he was. He began writing lists, not to guide himself, but to see the truth arranged on paper instead of circling endlessly in his head. One page held the consequences of telling the police, an official investigation, a recovery of remains, forensic confirmation, legal filings, media coverage, the collapse of a family who believed they had loved a good man. Another page held the consequences of staying silent, a secret preserved, a crime left unacknowledged, a nameless grave remaining in the woods, one family protected from a truth they never caused, and another condemned to continue living without closure. When he finished the two lists, he saw that neither path offered anything resembling justice. There was no version of the truth that would make everyone whole. He drove to the post office and stood in line without intention, feeling the weight of a letter he had not yet written. He imagined sending an anonymous package to the police, but even that felt like evasion, like handing away responsibility under disguise. He imagined speaking to the family of the missing man, explaining everything before involving law enforcement, but that too felt wrong, turning grief into a private burden they would have to carry before the world even acknowledged the crime. Every imagined action led to harm, only directed at different people in different degrees. The more he thought, the clearer one fact became. The only person who had chosen any part of this story was the man who had committed the crime. Every other person connected to it, victim, family, witness, descendant, had been pulled into the aftermath without consent. The killer had taken a life, then taken the truth, and now the man holding the tapes was forced to decide how many more lives it would take to deliver that truth back into the world. He tried returning to the forest, not as an investigator this time, but as someone seeking perspective. The air was colder now, the season shifting, the underbrush thinning. The stump sat exactly where he had left it, the soil around it disturbed only by wind and animals. He walked back to the shallow dip where the probe had struck resistance days earlier. He stood without kneeling, without touching the soil, without marking anything. The place did not feel haunted, cursed, or weighted by tragedy. It felt ordinary proof that nature does not preserve morality, only memory in the form of matter. The earth knows what is beneath it, but it does not resent holding it. Only people do. He stayed until dusk, until the light had thinned into a soft metallic gray. The winter birds moved overhead, and he felt no message in them, no symbolic echo, only the indifference of a world that has witnessed every kind of human wrongdoing and never paused to comment. Justice, he realized, is not something the world enforces. It is something people choose or avoid or postpone until it no longer resembles justice at all. That night, he did not listen to the remaining tape. He did not take notes or make new lists or search for the voice of reason inside whatever conscience still operated beneath fatigue. He simply sat in the dark and, for the first time since finding the box, allowed himself to acknowledge an unspoken truth. Not acting was also a decision. Silence was not neutral. It was participation. Morning came with no clarity, but with a kind of exhausted resolve. He drove to the city and requested, once again, the archived file for the missing man, this time not to study it, but to sit with the weight of it. The clerk handed him the envelope again, unaware of anything unusual in the request. He opened it at a desk, spread out the papers, and studied the photograph clipped to the top sheet. A man in his early 20s, eyes bright, smiling as if life had not yet presented a reason to fear anything. It was not the face of someone who knew danger was approaching. It was the face of someone betrayed before he ever had a chance to defend himself. He traced the edges of the photograph with his fingers, not sentimentally, but to acknowledge something real. The dead have no voice. Only the living can speak for them, and only the living can decide whether their story ends in silence or in consequence. When he left the archive, he knew he could no longer pretend that time would decide for him. The choice belonged to him, and there would be no undoing it once made. He drove home with the unusual calm that sometimes follows deep conflict, not peace, but acceptance. Inside, he sat at the table again, opened the box one more time, and removed the tapes. He rewound each one to the beginning, not to listen again, but to return them to the state they were in when he found them, as if acknowledging that the story they carried needed nothing more added to it. He picked up the last tape, the one he had not yet played, and turned it over in his hand. The label read simply, "For the one who finds this." He set it down, unopened, not out of fear, but because he already knew what it would contain. Apology was not needed. Explanation was finished. He looked at the box for a long time, then at the phone, then at the printed map he had drawn and marked. Both choices stood beside him now, not abstract, but physical. He did not move yet. He did not reach for the phone, or the fire pit, or the car keys. But the stillness was different now. It was not indecision. It was the moment before action. Whichever way he turned next, something would end, and something else would begin. There was no longer a path without consequence, only a path he could still choose. The moment of stillness did not last long. Once broken, it gave way not to hesitation, but to motion, steady and deliberate, as if every hour of uncertainty had finally aligned into a single direction. He rose from the table, closed the box gently, and placed it inside a canvas bag along with the printed map, the notebook containing his transcriptions, in the copied digital files he had made earlier. The originals, the physical evidence, would speak for themselves. The copies would exist only as insurance, nothing more. The weight of the bag was not much, yet it felt heavier than any object he had carried before. Not because of its mass, but because of the meaning inside it. It was no longer just a box of tapes. It was a verdict waiting to be delivered. He did not leave immediately. He walked through the house as if acknowledging the end of a chapter, pausing in rooms without recognizing why, touching the backs of chairs and door frames the way people sometimes do when they are preparing to leave a place they know will never feel the same again. He was not afraid of what was coming. The fear had already been spent in the days of indecision. What remained now was something quieter, heavier, and strangely steadier. The sense of responsibility finally accepted rather than resisted. The road to the regional police office was familiar, one he had driven many times for ordinary reasons. Today, every building along it felt different, not because they had changed, but because he had. The world outside was the same, yet no longer neutral. Every passerby was a reminder that people live unaware of the truths buried beneath their communities, unaware that the quietest places often hold the loudest histories, silenced only by the absence of a witness. Inside the station, he spoke calmly, not rehearsed but clear. He explained that he had discovered something on private land tied to an unsolved disappearance decades earlier. He did not embellish or dramatize. He simply stated facts. There was a recording, a confession, a probable burial site containing human remains. The officer at the desk listened first with politeness, then with sharpened attention. The moment he placed the box on the table between them, the tone shifted from routine conversation to formal procedure. Forms appeared. A second officer arrived, then a third. Not because they doubted him, but because they understood the seriousness of what he had brought. The box was opened, cataloged, sealed in an evidence container. The map was photocopied, then attached to a case number that had until that moment been empty. He watched the process unfold with a strange mixture of detachment and recognition, not relief, but the confirmation that the story he carried would no longer exist inside only him. It had transferred, as it was always meant to, into the hands of those whose role it was to follow truth to its end. Within days, the search team entered the woods, guided by the coordinates he had marked. The soil at the shallow dip yielded beneath the first careful excavation. What the earth had held for decades did not stay silent when exposed to air again. The remains were confirmed human. The personal item found with them, a rusted lighter engraved with initials, matched the missing man's belongings listed in the archive file. Forensic analysis confirmed what the tapes had already stated. The cause of death was blunt force trauma. The missing man was no longer missing. There were no dramatic headlines, no sensational news coverage. A brief local article appeared, reporting the recovery of remains tied to a historical disappearance. The killer's name was mentioned, but not with ridicule or anger, only finality. The article noted that the suspect was deceased. No prosecution would follow, but a crime long hidden had been identified at last. The family of the victim received the news quietly. They did not seek him out, did not ask to meet, did not demand explanation. But word reached him through a detective. They were grateful. They would be able to bury their brother properly, beside the mother who had died, believing he might one day return home. That was all they said. Nothing more was required. The other family, the family of the man who had made the tapes, faced a different kind of silence. Neighbors spoke in lowered tones. The widow closed her curtains for days. Their son stopped going into town. Guilt they had not earned still reached them, not as accusation, but as unavoidable consequence. No one blamed them publicly. No one demanded apology. Yet the weight of the truth settled into their lives like a shadow that could not be lifted simply by wishing it gone. He did not visit them. He did not write. The choice he had made did not grant him the right to explain it to them. Some grief was theirs alone. Weeks passed, not dramatically but steadily, until the world around him seemed unchanged again, except for the knowledge that something buried had finally been acknowledged, and that he had played the part he was given, not seeking recognition or forgiveness, but refusing to leave a story unfinished simply because it was painful. He visited the clearing one final time. The stump was still there, intact, but no longer a secret. The forest had not changed its tone, had not trembled or reacted. Nature did not grieve or celebrate. It simply absorbed the truth the way it had once absorbed the body, quietly, without judgment. Near the place where the remains had been uncovered, there now stood a simple wooden marker, temporary until a proper burial could be completed. He read the carved name, said nothing, and stood in silence long enough for the cold to settle through him. He did not feel absolved. There was nothing to be absolved from. He had not been part of the crime, only the silence that followed it. And silence, when broken, does not reward the one who breaks it. It simply ends. When he left the forest, he did so without looking back. The truth no longer belonged to him. It was no longer a private burden buried in a stump, sealed in a box, recorded in the quiet voice of a man who could not unlive what he had done. It belonged to the world now, to paper, to memory, to the earth where the dead would soon be given a name again. Justice had not come cleanly, but it had come, and whatever uncertainty had once lived inside him was replaced now by something else. Not pride, not peace, but a steadiness that comes only after a choice is made and cannot be undone. The story was no longer waiting, it was finally over. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. There are plenty more just like it coming soon. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who loves a good mystery, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And of course, don't leave just yet. There's another story waiting for you right here. Watch the next video, you won't regret it.